Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for electronic music techniques. As you can see, the topic of the day is synthesis, so let's go ahead and dive right in. We'll talk about what synthesis is, as well as some common forms of it. We'll talk about oscillators and noise, a little bit about scaling and mixing within synthesizers, and then introduce our good friend the LFO, which I was sort of indirectly showing the other day with that X-Trem effect in Studio One, but we'll look at it in more detail. So what is synthesis? Well, it's the creation of sound that does not rely on a recorded sample, and it's in the box, so to speak. It's all being done via a synthesizer. In this case, like a software synthesizer, but the idea is that we're not relying on some sort of traditional acoustic instrument or, a device which is playing recorded samples. Instead, we are really generating the sound from scratch. We will focus entirely on in-the-box synthesis or software synthesizers, which are also sometimes just referred to as soft synths. Namely, Mojito and Mai Tai. Those will be the two we look at. They come with Studio One. Over on the right, we have an image of Mojito on top and then Mai Tai on the bottom. Mojito is the synth that came with earlier versions of Studio One, and then as the software progressed, they added Mai Tai. Mai Tai is a bit more robust and has some more options and features and can overall be a bit more creative for sound design. So while we will show Mojito a little bit, we'll really focus on Mai Tai in terms of both teaching synthesis and like sound creation. And it is, despite being the synthesizer that comes with a digital audio workstation, it is quite robust, and you can get some really great sounds out of it once you understand how it operates. So just note that synthesis was born in the hardware age, and accomplishing synthesis is really popular to be done via hardware this day and age. It's really had a revival and a renaissance, but we're just not going to focus on that for this course because I don't want you all to have to purchase a physical outboard synthesizer like the ARP shown on the right. But I will say that learning a software synth will translate really well to learning a hardware synth. Sometimes when you look at a physical outboard synthesizer like the one shown on the right, or ones that get a lot bigger, it can seem intimidating and confusing and difficult to dive into. I promise that most of the controls, techniques, and ideas that are in Mai Tai, as an example, or most other software synthesizers, will be present in physical synthesizers as well, because these digital software synthesizers that we create are really emulating these physical devices, because that's where synthesis was born. So if you learn one, you're going to learn an awful lot about the other as well. So if you are into synthesis and working with physical synthesizers, you're going to learn a lot that will help you with those in the future if that's a path you decide to go down. So why synthesis, right? Why would we do this? We have microphones, we have instruments, we have people that can play those instruments into microphones, we have samplers, we have all these effects we can, add to recorded audio. So why would we want to do this at all? Well, one benefit is that there's no real noise to worry about. I mean, a case could be made that there is kind of some noise, but not in the traditional sense of like, I plug in my microphone to the preamp and then it goes through the board and then it goes through the compressor, and all these steps can add noise, and there's the noise from the room where we recorded. When we're doing synthesis, we don't have to worry about that. We're just generating audio signals purely in the digital realm in this sense. So when we're working with software synthesizers, we don't have to worry about a high noise floor or filtering out noise or room tone, or you know what I mean? Like all those things sort of go away. So that's a really great benefit. Can be incredibly cost effective. As mentioned, the Mai Tai synthesizer and the Mojito one, they both come with Studio One. And in this case, if you're working with Studio One Artist and you got the education discount, it's like $50 and you get two really robust synthesizers that can make some incredibly diverse sounds. So the idea of being able to get a lot of bang for your buck is absolutely true when it comes to synthesis, especially when we are talking about software synthesis. If you get really into like outboard synthesis and buying gear and Euro racks and like all these, sequencers and effects and filters, well, that can get really expensive, but you don't have to do all of that to get really great results for synthesis, but it can be really fun. It's really accessible. So going along with cost effective, there are so many synthesizers available. They come with pieces of software without you needing to purchase them. There are additional ones for free to download. There are great ones that you can purchase. They don't cost a ton of money. There are great resources. I mean, in addition to what I'm going to talk to you about, there are just dozens and hundreds of videos online for free that cover topics on synthesis, as well as diving into specific instruments. So let's say you're a person who likes to work with Serum. That's a very popular synth these days. You can hop online and catch so many great tutorials that help you figure out how any of these instruments will work. And another great thing too, if you learn Mai Tai, you'll have a better chance working with Serum. And if you learn Serum, you're going to have a great chance working with Massive, because a lot of these systems have a lot in common. unlimited sounds and incredible creative control. I mean, I'll show you, but you can open MaiTai and within 2 minutes, you could make a sound that has never been heard in the universe, ever. And that's pretty remarkable. And you could come up with another one 30 seconds later that no one has ever stumbled across, because there's just so many permutations of so many different controls that you can end up creating just entirely new sounds right away. And that's really exciting. And it's one of the things that draws me to synthesis. I do a lot of work with synthesizers like MaiTai or Massive, and I think it's really fun to create sounds from scratch to help generate music with, because it really has a unique stamp of yourself in that work compared to using, recorded instruments or recorded voices. It's just, you're not just capturing sounds that are already in the world, you're inventing them. And I think that that's really artistically exciting. It can, in certain circumstances, stand in place of real performers. Now, that's especially true when we talk about MIDI in the near future and we talk about really high-quality sample libraries, but we can also use synthesis to create some pretty gosh darn realistic instrument sounds, and if we are unwilling or unable to hire a performer to record that instrument in a studio, we might be able to get by with synthesizing that sound instead. And in fact, that was really popular in film scores for a while. They really leaned into using synthesis. So if you look at like the old Blade Runner movie, or like Chariots of Fire, there's a few films that really leaned into using synthesis, and they got really great musical and artistic results. One other cool thing about synthesis that we won't particularly talk about in this course, but there are what we call physical modeling synths. If you are a Logic user, you should check out Sculpture, which comes with Logic, and it's the idea that it's emulating like physical strings made of different materials. And that's what physical modeling synths do. They try to, through often very sophisticated means, physically model a actual sound source. Like Car Plus Strong is a cool string vibration synthesis theory that you might look up as well. But we have some really cool physical model synths that are designed to emulate real world stuff and sounds, and they can also be really cool, and they can also really expand your overall sound creating possibility palette with synthesis. And then one other thing that's really great about synthesis, and it will be important when we start talking about the MaiTai synthesizer itself, is that it's modular. Each little component of the synthesizer kind of does one thing, and if you can just look at each module and keep them separate, it becomes really easy to approach both the MaiTai synthesizer or the Mojito synthesizer, as well as other ones that you might explore in the future. So we're going to keep the idea of modularity in mind, and we're going to talk about how each little module does its own thing. And then there's many more reasons. We can't go into all of them today, but synthesis is awesome. So at the heart of pretty much any synthesizer will be an oscillator or oscillators. Some synths have one, some have many. And that is a device that produces a regular audio signal, typically a simple wave form. Common oscillators include like a sine oscillator, saw, pulse, triangle, square, random, or noise. Over here on the left of the screen, you can see I have some common waveform shapes. That means that when you set the oscillator in your synthesizer to make a sine tone, it's doing that. It's oscillating up and down in a sine pattern. And that's true on outboard synths too. Those were devices that actually would physically oscillate up and down. These oscillators in real synthesizers, real physical outboard synthesizers, they really are. They're little devices that physically oscillate and produce different amounts of voltage that will emulate these shapes that we have going on. In the world of software synthesizers, we can get a little bit more creative in how we do that. We don't actually have to tell like a part of our computer to physically oscillate up and down to create these forms. We can do it digitally, but the result is really similar. So when I say the word oscillator, I really do mean that. We have this component of the synthesizer that oscillates up and down and back and forth at slightly different patterns like the ones shown on the left, and we can get really different sound combinations as a result of how that oscillator is moving up and down. And then we can also add other oscillators. So one oscillator could be doing a square wave while the other is doing a sawtooth wave. One is filtered, one is delayed. So, even though it seems like we're starting with this really, really simple idea of just these really simple basic waveforms, we do other things after the fact to really increase the creative control of our sounds. So noise is one other option within the synthesizer, and over here on the right you can see that I have the two oscillators for the MaiTai synthesizer as well as the noise generator highlighted in green. So all the sources of our sound in the MyTi synthesizer will come from one of those three sources. We could have one on, we could have two of them on, or we could have all three of them on. I think it's best to start with just working with like one oscillator and see where you go. And as you can see, we have some controls over each one and they look very similar, especially the first two oscillators. We'll look at this in detail inside Studio One in a minute, but I want to show you where the sort of signal generation portion of the synthesizer is. And as mentioned, some synths can generate noise. So rather than just generating sine tones and square waves with these kind of, straightforward, periodic, more pitched sounds, we can have noise generators as well. And noise in this context is defined as random sine tones across the audible range of human hearing. They can be rapid, little overlapping and eliding sine tones at different frequencies. And there are different common types of noise, some of which you might be familiar with, and you may have heard of some of these before. But we have white noise, which is equal amplitude across the entire frequency spectrum. So white noise is pretty intense and includes a lot of high frequency content. And then there's also pink noise, which is equal amplitude within each musical octave. And based off the fact that we perceive music logarithmically and that the octave is really significant for how we perceive music, we can kind of say that pink noise is more in tune with how we actually perceive frequency. So pink noise is typically what you want to use for like tuning rooms and using EQs and that kind of stuff. Pink noise is going to give you a good representation of the audible spectrum as it relates to our hearing. We also have brown noise, which there's more decrease, that's 6 decibels per octave as we ascend in the frequency spectrum, so it's going to have even less high frequency content. And then blue noise, which is going to have an increase of 3 decibels per octave. And lastly, violet noise, which is an increase of 6 decibels per octave. So we have different forms of noise and labels that belong to them. As you can see over on the image from MyTi, we do have a noise generator underneath the two oscillators, and the way that you sort of move between white and pink and brown and blue and violet noise is with the color knob. So you move from different colors of noise, and I'll show you a little bit once we get into it how that relates to specific colors of noise, but that's how they sort of refer to it, so you can kind of blend and sort of smoothly go from one form of noise to the other. Scaling signals involves multiplying a signal by some value, which we talked a bit about before when talking about mixing audio in Studio One, how we can take a value and scale it with the fader, and really what we're doing is multiplying those values between -1 and 1 on our waveform by some amount to either decrease or increase all of those values proportionally. The goal of this process is to hear the sound at the correct volume, right? That's why we want to scale the signal so it's either loud enough or quiet enough, depending. And we often will automate the volume of the sound. So things will fade in and fade out, and we'll also have an amplitude envelope for scaling of synthesis signals. And we will also mix or add multiple signals together from different oscillators or from different synths. So we're going to have a number of places where we can control how much a signal is being scaled or not scaled along the way. And it's important to be diligent in how much signal you're generating at different levels. And as you can see here, my noise generator and my two oscillators, they each have a level control as well as a pan control. So the very first place that we can scale the amplitude of the signal from this synthesizer is with that level knob. So we have, level knobs for each of those. And as you can see over on the right, kind of in the upper right corner where it says global, we also have a volume knob for the entire synth. We're also going to have a fader for the entire track. And then we're also going to have the master output. So there's a lot of places to scale signal when we're talking about synthesis. And we always want to follow good procedures and make sure we have healthy signal every step along the way without being too loud or too quiet. Now, envelope. This is where our idea of the envelope really comes into full force. We've talked about it in a few cases before, both in terms of, automation of volume in Studio One, as well as just more conceptually. But here, we're really going to generate sounds from the ground up, where the envelope of that sound, that attack, decay, sustain, release, is tremendously important. So we will use that ADSR envelope to control the scaling of various parameters of a synth. Otherwise, they just go on forever. So 2 notes to that. 1, I say various parameters because we will primarily control the overall amplitude envelope of that synth. So when I press a key, how long does it take for the sound to turn on? How long does it sustain? And then when I let go of the key, how long does it take for the sound to stop making sound? So that's when I talk about, otherwise it goes on forever, right? A synthesizer is just oscillating. And if we don't have an amplitude envelope to tell us when to start and stop the sound, that tone just goes infinitely, right? Whether we're hearing it or not, it's still going. So we need to control that sound over time. But we're also going to control other things like filters and effects and modulation. We will also add envelopes to those. So as you can see here over on Studio One, we always have the amplitude envelope listed first of those 3 envelopes, and that's going to control the overall amplitude of the entire sound. So when I press the key, it's going to attack, decay, sustain, and release with the key. The other 2 can be assigned to things like the cutoff filter or the LFO, and we will show you how to do those when we dive into Studio One. So speaking of the LFO and modulation, let's talk about that because those are some terms we've touched on a little bit in the past, but we want to define them a little more firmly here. We can say that modulation is the multiplication of one audio signal by another. We will use an LFO, which is nothing more than a low frequency oscillator, to control other signals. So this is really important. The LFO is not a signal we hear, okay? So when I talk about 2 audio signals, one of them is the one we are hearing. The other is just scaling the other signal over time. So just to reiterate, the LFO is not a signal we hear. It simply helps us scale other signals over time. We will also add things like filters, delay, and other effects to further shape our sound, and we can control those with LFOs and other envelopes. So when we talk about an amplitude envelope, that's already a form of modulation because we're multiplying the sort of shape of that amplitude envelope over time. We'll do the same thing with our low frequency oscillator, and as you can see, kind of in the middle underneath the filter, we have LFOs. We have LFO1 and LFO2, and we can assign those to different things in our synth. I think the best example, and this will become a little clearer when we start listening to audio, but I think the best example for LFOs is to imagine walking into a room with a light, like a light bulb, and instead of having a switch to turn on or off, it has a little dimmer switch, like that you can turn right to turn the light all the way off or down. So I'm acting as the modulator. I'm acting as the signal that is modulating that light switch. So just pretend it was a volume knob instead, right? You know, I turn it up, the light turns on, or the music gets loud and we can turn it down. So if I'm an LFO, I just kind of turn it up and then I turn it down, and it's going to kind of, if it's volume, it's just going to be like wow, wow, which is a really great synth sound. And I could make that go pretty quick. We call it a low frequency oscillator because typically we don't have that rate of how quickly I turn the volume knob up and down. We don't go above 20 because 20 is where we start to hear waves if it's 20 times a second. So it's typically 20 or below that we call a low frequency oscillator. You can turn it above 20 and get some cool other audible effects, which we will discuss. But just know that if I'm talking about LFOs and that's a little confusing, just imagine someone turning a volume knob up and down. That's really what we're doing, and we'll even demonstrate that with the MyTi synth. And speaking of demonstrating, that's all we're going to talk about for synthesis in this regard. Now we're going to demonstrate a lot of these ideas in Studio One, and I think a lot of these things will solidify when you have some audible examples to latch onto. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so here we are in Studio One, and as you can see, as usual, I have a blank session. Let's go ahead and start creating some synthesis. So once again, we could go to the browser. We could make sure we are on the Instruments tab, and then under PreSonus, we will see all of the included instruments that come with Studio One or Studio One Artist. I'm going to go ahead and drag in an instance of the MyTi synthesizer because that is where we are going to spend most of our time. So as you can see, once I have created the instance of MyTi, it goes ahead and just opens the instrument for us. If I close this at any point, I can reopen it by clicking this little keyboard icon, and that will be the easiest way to open and close this instrument should I need to find it again. By default, when you load an instance of MyTi, unless you have told Studio One to do otherwise, it's going to sound like this. Which is fine. It's not my favorite sound. I actually think it's kind of a lame default sound, and it doesn't give a great first impression of this instrument, and the instrument can sound pretty good. I don't know, just something about it. It just doesn't, I don't know. I guess that's better up an octave, but I just don't like this sound. You can do a couple of things in Studio One if you want to just get started right away with making sounds. As mentioned in previous videos, most of these instruments and effects will have presets. So this is the default setting on the instrument. I have lots of different categories to begin with. So for example, if I jump into lead, these are going to be some pre-programmed settings from the people who make Studio One that are designed for MyTi to be like a lead, to play a melody, to be the forefront of your track that you're working on. So how about this one called, I don't know, Pickup? And then we can just audition it and play a few notes. Okay, well, I already like that one more. I'm not saying that's the best thing in the world. We could experiment in some, oh well, we can't ignore Temple of Doom. Okay, that's also kind of a cool sound. I think I would be great at naming presets for synths. That's all I'd do. I'd get hired by like Native Instruments or PreSonus. I wouldn't make them. I wouldn't program them. Someone else would play them for me. I'd sit in a room on like a big leather chair, an Eames Classic, and someone would just pluck a few notes, and I'd be like, Temple of Doom, boom, whole career, 6 figures. It's going to be great. I'm working towards that as soon as as soon as I'm ready. So, as mentioned, that is just one category of these presets. We can explore some other ones, maybe like a pad sound, so something that's going to be kind of long and sustained that might be great for like a harmonic background of chords. How about Blade Pad? Maybe it's supposed to sound like Blade Runner. That would be cool. That is totally meant to sound kind of like a 1980s Blade Runner type synth sound. Okay, so that's kind of cool. So that's another example of one of those categories. A lot of synths will come with an effects or like soundscapes category. That's always the one I go to first because I like weird sounds. So I don't know. How about what about long effects sweep? Yes, I like it. I don't know. What about Firewire? Because USB has taken over. I was hoping to be weirder. Water Cave. Oh, yes. It doesn't seem to change much, depending on which pitch I play. That's okay. It's just kind of a noisy sound anyway. I like it. Maybe a couple more. Roswell's Love Song. Story of my life. Ah! That was so intense. I can do this for hours, by the way. And I recommend you do this. It is actually really fun to just open these and audition some sounds and play around with them. We're going to talk in a second about how to build them on your own from the ground up. But in addition to auditioning these presets and just hearing what they sound like, you can do a couple of things. One, like I could play this bad bend sound. Okay, let's say I love that sound. I don't, but let's say I love that sound. I can look and be like, oh yeah, how did they accomplish that? Okay, well they used one oscillator on a high frequency on a sawtooth wave, and they put a filter with a relatively low cutoff frequency, and they have a pretty fast LF. Like, I can look and then I can think to myself, well, I can create a sound with some of those parameters when I go forward, and I can get close to that sound without necessarily just using it. Or I could just modify the sound a little bit. Like, I could just change things a little bit, and maybe, I'm just gonna... Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that got better, but it's different. No one's ever heard that before. I guarantee you no one's ever had that exact combination of things on this Mai-Tai synthesizer. There's just too many parameters. It's near infinite options, or it practically is infinite options. That's pretty cool. So you can use these as a starting off point. You can use them as inspiration, but it's fun to just play around with. So I recommend the very first thing you do when you create an instance of this synthesizer is just play around with some of these different sounds and see what they sound like to you. It's kind of cool. Strings. I think there's only a few in here. Keith's strings. Clearly I'm in a C minor mood today, but anyway, that's actually kind of a nice little... It's not the worst sound I've ever heard. So play around with these. I really think that's great. However, what we're also going to focus on is this other option. I'm just going to close these folders. We have this initialize option. And when we do this, it turns everything off except one oscillator. And this is our approach for synthesis. We're only going to look a little bit at this today. And then in the next few weeks, we'll explore every single module and control surface within this synthesizer. So to begin with, we have this single oscillator, which means we are just going to hear just this and nothing else. And if I play it, it's kind of intense to start with the initialize setting. All right, so this is showing us that we have one oscillator active. You'll notice the others I can turn on or off. Most things can be turned on or off. in the MyTy synth. The filter is on, but it's turned up all the way, so it's not really going to make much of a difference on our sound right now. I can turn it off. So it might have the subtlest shape change to the wave as a result, but even though it's on this initialized preset, it's not really doing anything. We could turn the cutoff frequency down. So that's something that's available. Just for the sake of things, I'm going to just turn the filter off. So all we hear is oscillator 1. Keep in mind, I could turn oscillator 1 off. We get nothing, right? There's no sound generating sources turned on. So oscillator 1, we can choose the type of waveform. So we can choose a sine tone, we can choose a sawtone, we can choose a triangle wave, or we can choose a square wave. So these are the 4 options available for oscillator 1. Let's go ahead and turn it to a sine tone so we have something a little purer and not quite so biting as the sawtooth wave. Okay, so this is oscillator 1. We can choose different waveforms. How about a square wave? I always liked square waves. It's an example of what we would call pulse width modulation, where as we turn this pulse width modulation amount up or down, we're changing the shape of that square wave. So how long does it stay active versus turning off? And it can change the sound quite a bit. I think that's actually kind of cool. As mentioned, we can attenuate the signal here. We can go up quite a bit, so we actually start with some headroom. It starts at -6, so we can increase this level if we need to. One of the other big things to keep in mind is this octave control here. It uses numbers like organ pipe systems, where each time we cut the value in half, we go up an octave, or every time we double the value, we go down an octave. So I could go all the way down to what's labeled as like 32 feet. So I'm hitting the same key on the keyboard each time. Okay, so you can have each oscillator, of these two at different octaves if you want as well. Let's go ahead and leave this one kind of low to start. Okay, you do have the option to tune by semitones, so that if you want to have this like play a minor second lower than you're playing. So I'm going to play a C on the keyboard, but you're going to hear B natural. Can go down 11 half steps or up 11 half steps. The reason we can only go up or down 11 is because if we hit 12, then we're going up or down an octave, so we may as well use this wheel. We also have fine tuning, and that lets us adjust even smaller than the half step. We're adjusting by cents, so we can hear a really small difference. So if we go all the way up or down, we start to approach a semitone or half step. They say semitone because PreSonus is a European company, and they say semitone and tone. In Europe, we say half step and whole step in America, so just know that that's why they use that. Panning, we can also send this left and right. Let's just leave that back center, and we're gonna talk about spread and sub in a future video. So let's just go ahead and change this, I don't know, to a different waveform for fun. Let's do the sawtooth wave. No, I hate that. Let's just do the sine tone. Let's go up 1 octave. Okay, so with just one oscillator going, and you know what, I lied. Let's go back to the pulse wave. It sounds too cool. Or the square wave, I guess I can call it as they label it here. The one other thing that by default is always active is this amplitude envelope. You'll notice all of them are they're not grayed out because they are all on all the time. They just might not be assigned to anything. So envelope 2 and envelope 3 might not be doing anything even though they are displaying. Amplitude envelope, this envelope number 1, will always be active. And you can see our attack, decay, sustain, and release. And this is where we can really start to hear how profoundly this changes our sound. So we can, in addition to actually grabbing these up here if we want, I like to use little dials. I feel like I just get a little bit more precise control and I can more readily see how many milliseconds. So if I want, right now, like if I bring this back to 0, my attack time is like instantaneous. The note goes from not being on to on. To demonstrate how profound the attack sound changes it, let's make my attack take a little while. Let's have it take, 1 whole second. So that changes it profoundly. And like automation of volume and panning in Studio One, where I showed you on the tracks, we can also create a more logarithmic or like exponential approach to this attack. I like to do it a shape closer to this for most of my attacks. So that's kind of cool. Right now there is no decay. It starts by default with no decay. And then if I decrease the sustain and increase the decay, and then maybe I can make this have a little bit better of a shape, but a little bit shorter. This way I can kind of reach that peak amplitude and then go down just a little bit from where the max amplitude is, which really just gives a little bit more interesting of a shape. And it also tends to resemble a lot of the sounds created by acoustic instruments. Okay, so that might be a little profound. First of all, I'm going to decrease that, and I'm going to make the sustain level just a little bit less, or a little higher, so the difference between the two is less. Maybe even less. Let's just have a real subtle, maybe a little bit more. And I tell you what, I'm going to make this not quite so extreme, and I'm going to also maybe make this a little bit greater of a difference again. And you'll notice that it also just ends the second my finger comes off the key. The release makes a profound influence as well. So let's increase the release time and let's change its shape, maybe to something like this. Okay, that's a little longer than I wanted. Let's make it, like 500 some milliseconds, right around there. That looks pretty good. Okay, so that really changes the overall shape of my sound. And as our sounds become even more complicated, that will become even more important for us. So if nothing else, if you just start by working with this oscillator, tuning it, choosing a waveform, and then going to your amplitude envelope, you have some pretty cool possibilities already. Now keep in mind, I could turn oscillator 1 off and turn oscillator 2 off, and it could have a different sound. Maybe this one has a triangle wave that's really low. Okay, I could also maybe pan this a little to the left, and how about we turn oscillator 1 back on and pan a little to the right. Now I'm going to hear both of these oscillators at once, both passing through this amplitude envelope. I think it can actually be cool to have these things slightly out of tune with each other. You get some cool little phase cancellation. So let's fine tune one up a little and one down a little. Pretty subtle. Let's make it a little even more extreme. Things perfectly in tune are boring. Okay, that actually starts to sound pretty cool. What if I turn these off? And what if I turn on my noise generator instead? So as mentioned, we have a color spectrum that moves between different colors of noise. So what's basically happening with that is the further we move this color wheel to the right, the higher frequency content becomes more pronounced, and we also lose low frequency content. So I actually tend to like this kind of in the lower end of the color spectrum. And I sometimes will add this just to add some grittiness to some sounds. It can sound cool. So you'll notice you don't really notice that it's there until I turn it up a little more, and then it becomes really present. But when I turn it on and off, it makes a pronounced difference, and it's actually kind of cool with all three of these things happening at once. The one other thing I'll show you just for today is, again, the filter option. So we've talked about filters before, and the primary thing to know is choose which type you are creating. So are we doing like a low pass filter with 24 dB ladder? So with each octave we go down, we slope of 24 decibels, we decrease. Or do we want to do a low pass at 24 decibels going downward, but where we also have a little bit of resonance? We have a resonance at the cutoff frequency. You'll notice we get a little boost. Or we could also do a low pass with a 12 decibel ladder, so a slower slope as we attenuate frequencies. Or we could also do a band pass where we only let a certain amount through, or we could also do a high pass. I tend to work with either this low pass or the low pass with the resonant peak, one of these two. So let's just go ahead and leave it here, and let's play a key and then turn my cutoff filter down. So even with these few options, my overall amplitude envelope, my filter, and my oscillators, which includes a noise generator, we already have some pretty cool sounds that we can make, especially if we experiment and keep moving things around and adjusting and trying different combinations. This alone, if you went back a few decades, would be a really powerful instrument, either from the digital sense or in a physical sense, and you could do some really cool stuff. So I really think it's worth appreciating and exploring some of these more straightforward controls before we look at some of the other cool stuff. So that is all we are going to look at for today with the MyTi synthesizer, but coming up in the next few weeks as we explore MIDI, we'll also talk about adding more of these options, controlling them, and getting into some more cool and advanced sound design.